Imagine walking down the streets of New York City in the year 1900. You expect to see a chaotic mess of horse manure and the deafening roar of primitive internal combustion engines. But instead, you are met with an eerie, futuristic silence. Nearly 40% of the cars humming past you aren't burning gasoline. They are powered by smooth, quiet, and clean electricity. At the dawn of the 20th century, the electric car wasn't just a niche experiment for environmentalists. It was the undisputed king of the road. Wealthy elites, socialites, and city doctors all chose electric vehicles because they were infinitely more reliable than the mechanical nightmares of the gas-powered world. Therefore, in a world before the modern gas station, electricity was the clear winner of the future. But today, we are told that the electric vehicle revolution is a brand new, cutting-edge technology born from modern green movements. This is a massive historical deception. We aren't living through a new invention. We are desperately trying to recover a technology that was systematically murdered over a century ago. Why did a silent, perfect industry vanish almost overnight, leaving us trapped in a century of smog and noise? The answer isn't found in a lack of technology, but in a brutal, calculated war of marketing, cheap oil, and corporate greed that reshaped the entire planet. We had the future in our hands, but we were forced to throw it away. To understand why the world abandoned clean energy, you first have to understand just how dangerous and disgusting gasoline cars actually were. In 1910, starting a gas-powered car was a literal, life-threatening gamble. You had to manually turn a heavy iron hand crank at the front of the vehicle. Therefore, if the engine backfired, the crank would snap back with enough force to shatter your wrist or break your arm. But electric cars had none of these problems. You simply turned a key or pushed a lever, and you were moving instantly. Electric cars were silent, vibration-free, and produced zero toxic fumes. Therefore, they were marketed as the gentleman's choice, and were especially popular among women who didn't want to deal with the grease and violence of a gas engine. But this very advantage became a psychological weapon used against the industry. Rival manufacturers began a toxic smear campaign, claiming that electric cars were weak and unmasculine. They successfully branded the electric vehicle as a woman's car, implying that real men needed the roar and the struggle of a gasoline engine to prove their status. Therefore, the quiet efficiency of electricity was reframed as a defect. But the final nail in the coffin wasn't just a social stigma. It was a technological breakthrough that turned the gasoline engine's greatest weakness into its greatest strength, forever altering the course of human history. The year 1912 was the true turning point, where the silent future began to die. Up until that moment, the electric car's primary selling point was its ease of use. But a man named Charles Kettering invented the electric self-starter for Cadillac. Therefore, for the first time in history, a driver could start a gasoline engine from the comfort of the driver's seat without risking a broken arm. Suddenly, the main reason to buy an electric car vanished. But there was another player in the game: Henry Ford. While electric cars were being built as luxury items for the wealthy, Ford focused on the brutal efficiency of the assembly line. Therefore, he was able to produce the Model T at a price that the average worker could actually afford. In just a few years, a gasoline car cost less than half the price of an electric equivalent. But even with the price gap, electricity still had a fighting chance due to its cleanliness. Therefore, the industrial titans needed one more thing to seal their victory: a limitless supply of fuel. And nature provided it in the most dramatic way possible. Massive oil discoveries in Texas and around the world made gasoline cheaper than bottled water. Suddenly, the energy density of oil became impossible to ignore. But this transition wasn't just about economics. It was a structural trap that ensured humanity would be tethered to a pump for the next 100 years. As oil flooded the market, the entire infrastructure of the world was built to support the internal combustion engine. Because gasoline was so cheap and powerful, cars could now travel long distances between cities. Therefore, the limited range of early lead-acid batteries became a massive liability. But the electric car companies didn't have the massive capital that the oil barons possessed. They couldn't build a national network of charging stations. Therefore, the world made a collective, unconscious choice. We chose the convenience of long-distance travel over the health of our cities. But consider the psychological impact of this shift. We moved from a decentralized energy model, where you could potentially charge a car from any electrical outlet, to a centralized model, controlled by massive oil corporations. This was the meter problem all over again. The oil industry realized that they could control the flow of human movement by controlling the fuel. Therefore, they aggressively lobbied governments to build roads and systems that favored gasoline. But the most tragic part of this story is the lost century of innovation. Because the electric car was buried in the 1920s, all research into battery technology effectively stopped for 80 years. We spent a century perfecting the explosion of dead plants, while the potential of the electron was left to gather dust in the basement of history. Looking back at the silent streets of 1900, we realize that we haven't actually moved forward as much as we think. We are currently spending hundreds of billions of dollars to reach a level of urban silence and air quality that we already possessed over 100 years ago. Therefore, the modern EV revolution is actually a massive exercise in historical recovery. We are finally correcting a mistake that was forced upon us by the marketing geniuses of the early 20th century.
But imagine where we would be today if battery research hadn't been halted for 100 years. If we had applied the same level of genius to the lithium-ion cell that we applied to the fuel injector, we would likely be living in a world beyond fossil fuels already.
Therefore, the story of the electric car is a haunting reminder of how easily the better technology can be murdered by the more profitable one. We didn't choose the gasoline engine because it was superior. We were manipulated into it by a perfect storm of cheap oil, toxic masculinity, and assembly line economics. But today, the silence is returning. The quiet hum of the modern EV is the sound of an ancient debt being repaid. We are finally returning to the path we should have never left. The question is no longer whether the future is electric. It's how much more we could have achieved if we hadn't let the past be stolen from us.